And so in order to create the change that we want to see, sometimes we've got to take the words climate change totally out of the discourse and talk about something else, because it's all about behavior change and behavior shift. We need to talk about different things in different ways, because there are a lot of people within our culture, within our society, within our country that don't understand climate change, 2, don't care, or 3, think it's so big that what is my little action going to mean in the scheme of things. So we've got to reframe the narrative around those sorts of things.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Silos with me, Sophia Jamil. As mentioned in the introduction, this episode is done in collaboration with the East-West Center, and it's part of their Spring Virtual Institute for their academic fellows under the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, or YSEALI. And this episode is the final of the eight episodes that we're doing in collaboration with the East-West Center, where we've been exploring different issues related to environmental sustainability. And what's exciting about all these episodes is that many of the questions posed to our guest speakers are from the fellows themselves. And these fellows are young Southeast Asians who are doing really great work in terms of environmental conservation in their respective countries. So I'm very happy today to have with me Kara Puketapu-Dentice, from New Zealand, and I'll just quickly read his bio. He is the Director for Economy and Development at Hutt City Council in Wellington, New Zealand, and he has a demonstrated history of working in resource management, iwi, and community development and housing. His experience includes leadership in numerous governance forums, such as post-settlement governance, pre-settlement, committees of regional and district council, and education boards. And Kara is also very active in the international community, where he's been a previous fellow in the Asia Pacific Leadership Program in the East-West Center, and also a current Obama Foundation leader for the Asia Pacific. So Kara, thanks a lot for being with me today.
Not a problem, thank you.
Yeah. Maybe you could just start off with, tell us a bit more about yourself and how did you get into the line of work that you're currently in?
Okay, so kia ora everyone, hello everyone, aloha. So my name is Kara. I hail from a very small town in Wellington, New Zealand, and in my town I was quite lucky to be brought up in amongst the bush, the environment, the rivers, the streams, the hills. So I guess the natural environment, specifically where I live and was brought up, was everywhere, and sort of, I guess, got embedded into my psyche and to who I am. And obviously anyone that sort of knows New Zealand knows its beauty, knows the natural environment is what really defines it. And I guess, like most New Zealanders, we love our hills, we love our cold winters, our hot summers, our rain, our bush, our wildlife. And there have been many people who have travelled to New Zealand for that very reason. So yeah, I guess that sort of has had a huge influence on me. I'm, by qualification, I have a Master's in Resource Management, Geography, and a Bachelor of Arts in Geography. So that sort of space has always, I've had a passion for that space for a very long time. I sit on a number of committees where we are responsible for creating interventions or policy interventions to improve our water quality. So although New Zealand has been seen by the rest of the world as a place which is in many ways clean and green, we do have some significant issues with our water, fresh water in particular, and that's been fueled very much by urban development, intensification of our urban areas, as well as dairy farming and intensification of land. So, I've been part of a number of committees to see how we might address those significant issues so that our future generations can enjoy our streams, our waterways, and our oceans, and sort of, pass on the ethic of stewardship, that guardianship, that we're making sure that our future generations can enjoy the abundance that we currently enjoy and that my parents and my grandparents enjoyed before me. I'm in that sort of space right now. Currently, I am the Director of Economy and Development at Hutt City Council. So in that area, I'm sort of responsible for the growth of our city, enabling housing, but also making sure that interface with housing, the need to ensure that people have homes, is provided for, whilst also making sure that we're not compromising our environment at the same time. So how do we find that balance? I'm also on a trust where we have strong connections with an environment that is no longer that has been considered under legislation as a legal person, which is, in my understanding, the first of its kind in the world, which I think is quite exciting. In New Zealand, we have a forest, a significant forest, which is considered and deemed a legal person, as well as a water body, a big river, the Whanganui River. And so that's quite an interesting scenario, and also an interesting framing for how we might look at and how we might take the responsibility of caring for those humans, I guess, those living beings. So as New Zealanders, we're sort of facing that challenge right now. How do we interact with this? How do we manage this? How do we manage our interactions? How do we manage the effects that we are causing on those environments? And then how do we protect it for future generations to come? So yeah, we've got a whole number of challenges ahead of us, and I just love the challenge. I think it's really, really exciting, and I think there's a lot to learn. And I guess I was brought up with the mentality of making sure that I made a contribution, and that there was never a challenge that was too big for me to lean into, and that if I don't do it, then who else is going to do it? And I don't know if I could live with it if something did go wrong. Where I could have actually supported or provided my weight into something. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. I mean, we'll definitely go into the topic about the natural spaces that have been recognized as a person. I mean, that's really something that you don't see pretty much anywhere else. Maybe you could, so we know that, Indigenous peoples have a lot of strong relations with the land, and, are often said to be, stewards and even protectors of natural spaces. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about the relationship between humans and environments, particularly from the Maori culture, and anything particular within the community.
Yeah, I guess so. Within Māori culture, the word that we have to describe ourselves is tangata whenua. And tangata whenua means literally people of the land. So our genealogy, as we like to, as we believe, is that we originate from the land. We come from the land, and within our cultural narratives, within our stories, we have an Earth Mother or Papa Tuanaku. We have a Sky Father, which is our sky, and we have a whole number of deities that speak to our interactions within the natural world and lived environment. And we have deities of the forest, deities of the ocean, deities of cultivated foods, and deities of uncultivated foods. And so those deities are expressions of our understanding of our world and how we interact with it. And in our genealogy, in our narratives, in our stories, we as tangata whenua, as people, are considered to be the last born. So the fish, the birds, the eels, all those things, all the trees and everything were born before us, and we are the last born. And in saying that, that framing of us as humans as the last born, sort of puts this framing of our, I guess, because within Māori culture, hierarchy is quite significant. Where you are born in the ranking is of significance, and so by saying that we as humans were born last, inherently within our culture, humbles us as humans to be, I guess, in sort of coarse terms, sort of less significant, but then all of our elders that were born before us. And when I talk about elders, our ancestors who were born before us were the birds, and all those sorts of things. So it's about framing us and recognizing that we are the last born, and that our natural environment is our ancient ancestor, our tupuna, as we put it. And then when you frame it in that sense, there's a certain reverence that you place on them, a certain importance that you place on them. And that's how we like, and that's how we do frame it within our cultural traditions and our narratives. That's something that we are trying to re-embed within our cultural psyche in New Zealand. I think one of the issues that we are confronted with today is that there's a sense of entitlement. There's a sense that this environment is for us. It is ours. It is ours. It's a gift to us. Within a Māori worldview, it's not a gift. It's a responsibility. Just like the culture of when your parents come of age, then it's the responsibility of you as their children to ensure that they're taken care of. It's the same modality of thinking that we apply to our environment. We've got to make sure that they are taken care of as our ancestors, as our elders. And so that's the framing that we are trying to reimagine within our society. We are trying to unlearn this language of our environment as a resource, because when we frame our environment as a resource, it's then prescribed with this extractive way of thinking, right? You need to extract resources when we know that our land, our waterways, are our ancestors, are our mother. And would we treat our mother like a resource, like something that we can extract from her, a transaction of sorts. And I guess my answer to that is probably no. We probably don't want to do that. And where we are right now, in terms of our environmental crisis, climate change, all sorts of issues, deforestation, the abuse of our waterways and our natural environment, has seen that seeing our environment as a resource to be extracted from, to pollute, is incredibly unhelpful, incredibly disgusting, and will not be beneficial for us going into the future, as we continue to occupy this world. So that relationship that we need to have from I guess from my perspective, needs to change, and we need to see our environment as more of a relationship, more of a partnership, more care, more love, more consideration, and less extractive. There is so much abundance in our world. There is so much abundance in our earth, in our land, in our waterways. There is so much potency there. We just need to nurture it in the right way, and mold it in the right way, and change our ways, and go to, in my world, although we are in a new world, and today is the most change we'll ever see, is today, but tomorrow there'll be even more change. Today is the most complex day that we would have ever seen, but tomorrow will be even more complex. But I still think that there is value in us looking at the old ways, or more traditional ways of doing things, and possibly applying new tools and new ways of thinking, but utilizing more traditional understandings and relationships and connections with the world and our environment. It's kind of like that saying, thinking global but acting local. Oh, there we go. Keep local. There we go. It's like that, right? That sort of framing, right? How can we use our amazing tools that have been created globally, within a local setting, using local thinking, from that land, from that community, from that place, and from that space, because it is that community that knows their environment the best. And it's that community that is also dependent on that environment for their ability to live and to thrive. So it affects them directly.
Yeah. I like your point about how it's about trying to change or reframe it back to traditional ideas of responsibility, and as a human, you're lower down the food chain. And you should be more humble, rather than think that you're there to extract and dominate the rest of nature. Because just the previous episode that we had, I spoke to Reverend Susan Hendershot and Nana Fairman from the US, and we were talking about faith-based perspectives on environment, and that whole faith-based movement of talking about environment from different faith perspectives. And for Reverend Hendershot, it was the greening of Christianity only in the US only came about in, say, the 1970s, like as a movement. And and that was very different. The current movement now, where it's your role as stewards to protect and be responsible for the environment, is very different from the past rhetoric of dominating, man being dominant over the earth. So that sort of framing, and getting people to change that sort of understanding of how they interpret religion. I think there's a bit of parallels here when you're talking about bringing back traditional ideas and values.
Totally. And I think, I guess, within all religions, there's different variations, and there's different beliefs, and there's different leanings towards different teachings, and I think within those religious scriptures there is a lot for us to look at and to learn from. But I think in some of the readings that I've also seen about sort of that dominant mentality, particularly sort of within sort of Christian religions, is there has been a sort of a change in the framing and the thinking, and that's sort of happening today within New Zealand, and it's great because they're a strong community as well, who can be activated and who work and live within particularly a lot of our rural communities as well, and they know how to bind together and create that strength to move things and to lead action on the ground, which is really, really inspiring. So yeah, but there's also that, and I'll probably will be challenged on this, but hey, look, I'm all about disruption. There's also that challenge around sort of some of the things that we've also seen around, particularly with Christian and I guess that's a dominant religion here in New Zealand, is that mentality of thought that it's okay, we've got to live here, we've got to be our best and do our best, and then we go to heaven, and then so there's also been this rhetoric around how that mentality can see that we don't necessarily have real strong consideration for our time currently on earth, because the real world, the real life is in heaven, and that extractive mentality can be unhelpful, but it's great to see a change in that thinking, and I've seen lots of writings about in response to sort of that thinking, where people have said, what if Earth is heaven? What if Earth is heaven? And that's a beautiful thought.
Okay, just on that point, have there been, while environmental conservation and environmental protection is a value that is being presented by both Indigenous communities, the Maori culture and Christianity, for example, has there been a conflict in saying Christianity perhaps would see Indigenous beliefs as being animistic, and there's a lack of cooperation on that front, or is it not an issue at all?
I think not necessarily in modern times, but previously there was definitely a conflict. As I said, the dominant religion within New Zealand is Christianity, Catholicism, monotheistic religion, and then that interface between a monotheistic religion with Māori culture that has a whole number of different deities and gods, and there's definitely such more pagan in its sort of understanding of the world, and different interactions and different gods and female gods and male gods and gods that are both genders, was at the point of colonization a huge sort of the world, the minds were blown, so this whole concept that there is only one God and that interface was quite difficult at the point of colonization, the point of contact with European coming to New Zealand. However, I think over time, like most cultures, we've adapted and adopted and changed things, and you'll see that we mix our traditional beliefs and cultural beliefs with Western religion on a daily basis. It's interconnected, it's interchangeable, and we see it purely as a mechanism to ensure that we can bind people together and that we can create cohesion and community, and a sense of purpose. But that's not always the case. It's not in all instances, but it's typically how we do it. There has definitely been a strong renaissance, particularly within my tribal group, around rebirthing and giving life to our traditional prayers, traditional chants, traditional thinkings around our world and our understanding of the world. So there's been a real renaissance in that space, which I think is just absolutely beautiful. But it's not to say that our sort of affiliations with our more sort of monotheistic religions are undermined. I think it's the coming together of both, and that's about enriching all of us, and ultimately, if it helps us, apply different ways of thinking in terms of how we become stewards, then all power to it. In terms of the place of our spiritual beliefs, we use it quite a lot in terms of cleansing water. We do it when, for instance, there has been a contamination of a waterway, whether that be sewage or anything like that, or a death in a waterway. So we use our traditional chants to undertake a process of cleansing, or to place what we call a rahui, which is a ban in a particular area. So that's our mechanism for controlling spaces and ensuring that activity doesn't happen in an area. We use that approach where resources have been depleted. Sorry, I shouldn't be calling them resources. Where our cousins, where our descendants, our relatives, our fish stocks, our eels, all of those things have been depleted. And we place a ban on those areas so that the stocks can come back. We also place bans on areas where we might have had a sewage discharge into a waterway. Obviously, you don't want to be eating food from a stream where there's also been human feces. That interaction's not the best. And we also make sure that those people who are responsible for that contamination are also appropriately dealt with. And we're moving we are moving more towards a restorative justice approach in terms of dealing with contamination of our waterways and of our environment. We find that the legal justice system here in New Zealand isn't that flexible and agile, and that more money is spent on the process and getting lawyers involved in the process than actually in the remediation of the harm and the effects on the environment which were caused by the actions in the first place. There are many instances where court cases cost $100,000 plus, and then the fine is only $50,000 or $10,000. It's just the story of our life. It's just ridiculous. So we think that in no way does the natural environment, does a river or a stream see any benefit or any restoration in that process. The focus has been on the law, the breaking of the law, but what about that environment? And I think that's sort of one of the reasons why we have been so staunch in our advocacy of enshrining our waterways and our natural environments into law as human beings, to be seen as human beings, so that when offence is caused, where damage is caused, where harm is caused, then there's a real consequence, and that there is a restoration of the harm. in Māori we have a term called mana, which relates to the prestige of an environment, its ability to produce food, its ability to feed people, its ability to nourish those which are dependent on it. And we see that an attack on the environment's mana, ability to thrive, as a huge offence, as well as its moding. So the moding is a term that we use that relates to the emotional connection that we might have to a space, that spiritual connection that we have to a waterway. So I guess a good example of moding or a change of mode is, we'll look at a stream. 5 years ago, that stream was beautiful. It had trees around it, and it had fish in it, and they were all swimming. And you could go down to that stream, and you could go for a swim in that stream. 5 years down the track, all the trees are gone. There's no fish in there. The banks are now concrete, and it's full of rubbish. What we would say is it's moding. It's that emotional connection that you have with it is degraded and is gone and is unacceptable. And your spiritual connection with it is now gone because it's no longer a space of beauty. It's a space of degradation. We are seeking to enshrine things like mana, its prestige, and its ability for the environment to thrive, and moding that emotional connection, to be those things to be protected in our legislation as it relates to all parts of our environment. And so those are some of the conversations that we're having at the moment with our legislators. So for us, that's really, really important.
I like your point about putting how Maori communities put a ban on, say, a stream that's being, fish stocks are being depleted. You ban and to allow the fish stocks to regenerate. And there's a lot of parallel with communities in traditional communities in Indonesia, where they have this traditional system as well. They call, at least the one in Sumatra, they call it lubuk larangan, like for a period of time, no fishing, no nothing, to allow that process of regeneration of natural life. But that only happens if the indigenous community or local community there is very strong in implementing it. So where they're not strong, or they don't have much legal rights over it, then they can't do it. And I guess it's, I'll just bring in a question from one of our fellows, which kind of touches on this issue as well, about the relation between indigenous people and the government. So Kim San from Cambodia says, it seems that the Maori people are successful in communicating and working with the government to raise their voice and protect their legacy. However, the gaps in communication between indigenous people and government, the gaps are still very wide in Cambodia, despite efforts from NGOs or local governments to raise awareness about indigenous legal rights. What is the lesson that can be learned behind the success of the Maori people in working with the government to protect their land and natural resources?
That's a big question. I guess the first thing that the person who asked that question will probably understand and realize is that it takes a long time. We've been fighting this fight since 1840 to get our voice heard, and to have our expression of our culture and understanding of the world embedded in legislation and enshrined in legislation. It takes a very, very, very long, it's a very, very, very long journey to get to this point. And I guess in many senses, it takes a lot. What it takes is leadership, leadership within those communities to hold on to a vision and to drive that vision forward and to bring people along with you on that journey, to get that movement happening, to build the momentum in a particular direction. And it takes guts to keep on going, even though people are telling you this will never happen, this will never change. I guess I sort of hold on to that saying, don't ever believe that a small group of committed people can't change the world, because in fact it is the only thing that ever has. And so
Margaret Mead,
she's lovely, and she's got a whole bunch of lovely quotes. And you know, in the pits of despair, just hold on to quotes like that. Hold on to the voice of your elders. Hold on to their legacies. Hold on to their vision. Hold on to their dreams. Hold on to their aspirations, and let that be the fire in your fight, because it is a fight. And you know, I've been on fights and journeys. My parents, my grandparents, and my great grandparents have been on fights and journeys for a very, very long time, to get what we've got. And every generation has got a little bit. And the more those little bits you build together, they soon become big bits. And over time you'll get there. But it requires energy, it requires effort, it requires leadership, it requires guts, it requires boldness, it requires disruption, it requires hard conversations with your own people, with your own family, with your own community. It requires change, it requires unlearning and relearning new ways and of doing things and of thinking about things. It requires failure. You will fail, but you must get back up again. So on every one of these journeys, that's sort of been a part of it. You know, that those challenges have always been a part of it. So it's about understanding and being clear in what you want, and clear in your conviction about what that is, and then holding on to that, and making sure that you don't settle for the crumbs on the table. If it's going to take you longer to...
Yeah.
What's that?
Sorry. I mean, that's interesting you say that it's an intergenerational fight. So it's not just this generation's responsibility, it's ensuring that the generations after them continue the fight. And I guess in a way it's also to be realistic that you can't win everything. Ideally you'd like to, but obviously you can't. So I think that in a way puts a bit more pragmatism in the way we look at how we struggle for things. And I think because, like, you know, just interacting with some of the fellows, you know, all these climate change statistics and studies talking about how we're all going to die after, like, you know, in the next generation or so, you know, that kind of like time frame of like we have to act now gets people very anxious. But when we take that pressure away, as much as those statistics may be true, but taking that pressure away is, I think, necessary in some regard in terms of how we need to fight for local action. Would you say so?
I totally agree, and I think it's about how we frame it. You know, telling, you know, some of the work that I've been doing, or been part of in terms of climate change and climate awareness, requires us to change our discourse and how we convey that message to ensure that the outcome that we are trying to achieve is achieved. And so in order to create the change that we want to see, sometimes we've got to take the words climate change totally out of the discourse and talk about something else, because it's all about behavior change and behavior shift. We need to talk about different things in different ways, because there are a lot of people within our culture, within our society, within our country that don't understand climate change, 2, don't care, or 3, think it's so big that what is my little action going to mean in the scheme of things. So we've got to reframe the narrative around those sorts of things to make it successful. We've got to talk about mode shift, getting out of our individual cars and into public transport because of efficiency, because of cost, because of all those sorts of things. As drivers, what are people's why? And then framing our narrative to ensure that we get to people's why. Because climate change doesn't necessarily hit people's pockets straight away or affect them directly straight away. For some people, it's quite clear that it does, and it's right there, literally lapping on their doorsteps. But for others, for the majority of people who we need to change to affect the climate change, because they are the greatest emitters and the greatest people who are dependent on coal and fossil fuels and all those sorts of things, we need to change the narrative and create momentum of language in different areas, in different ways, in different spaces and places. That's not to say that we stop shouting and screaming from the rooftops, because we still need that. And we also need to celebrate. We also need to celebrate the success of where we are. If we look at where we were 10 years ago in terms of this climate change conversation, we were still having arguments about it. There wasn't even consensus in our science community about climate change 10 years ago. And so here we are now, where there is pretty much 100% consensus on the science of it, and those people who deny it are just absolutely ridiculous, and should have their PhD stripped from them. And we have created significant shifts in a short period of time, and that bit by bit by bit by bit can hopefully snowball into more action and more activity. And so I think we need to celebrate the success that we've got so far, even though we know that if I said this in front of some people, we'll go, what? We can't celebrate success. We're staring down the barrel of an apocalypse and the world is ending. But I think we need to stop and reflect, at least. If we're not going to celebrate the success that we've seen so far, let's stop and actually reflect and see the change that we've actually created in the last 10 years in terms of climate change, in terms of the narrative. And then let's go, oh, wow, okay, this is actually achievable. This is actually doable. Within our community, we are having conversations about climate change in a whole number of places and spaces where we thought we wouldn't actually be having conversations about climate change. And we're having conversations with people about climate change, and they don't even know that we're having a conversation about climate change. Because they're like the best win in the world. And we're changing their behaviors and actions, and they're doing it because they want to, because they see personal benefit out of it. And we're creating a climate win, a climate change win out of it at the same time. So it's great, it's exciting. Let's reflect on where we are. Let's not be so disheartened by everything, because if we do, we'll just sort of bury our heads. Let's celebrate the wins, and then let's build the momentum off those wins, create more wins into the future.
Right. We've got quite a few questions related to multi-stakeholder cooperation. Mega from Indonesia says, with regards to the unimaginable impacts over decades of harmful harvesting and massive deforestation. How can we bridge the gap between the different mindsets of growth within all the working sectors to increase holistic cooperation with other Indigenous groups, academics, organizations, and government?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I think the question there is, how do we collaborate together and cooperate together to create shared outcomes? I think one of the biggest problems that we have in that space, and I guess in particular within New Zealand and within cultures, is that we've got to understand what creates a competition in the first place, and then quite often those issues, are driven by funding. So I don't know how that particularly works within sort of large farming groups, but I guess a sort of scenario in our head that creates that lack of cooperation within groups that are committed to achieving the same outcomes is that they get funded by different organizations for different outcomes, or they're competing for the same funding. And that creates that lack of collaboration and lack of willingness to work in partnership with each other. In New Zealand, we've got a big problem where we've got, well, I think it's a big problem anyway. We've got a population of 5 million people and like 8 or 9 universities, and they all compete against each other. And it's just such a small population in such a small space. I'm going, why do we need 8 or 9, tertiary institutions? So those are significant issues. I think we need to look at, in terms of sort of within the farming environment, to create that collaboration, is creating a brand around things, and then so, for instance, how can regions and farmers collaborate together to create a brand that's specific to their area, which then they can market to the rest of the world, and then ensuring that the ethical standards around it are also applied, and using that as a brand as well. The wine industry in New Zealand do it really, really well. The wine industry globally, the region of Champagne in France, or Champagne, do it really, really well. So I think there are models out there where you can apply, where you can create a brand that's associated with food, that's associated with the product that you're trying to create, that is certified organic, that is practicing, that is proven to be applying best practice in terms of how they utilize the land and how they grow foods, and how they care for their workers as well. So that there are ways that we can start to do that, and bringing people in together and pulling them together under that brand within that specific region, so that they can collaborate under the mantle of that brand, and create economic outcomes for them as farmers, but also creating that in a way monetizing their ethical stewardship, and for the benefit of their community. So I think there are models out there that we can try and apply that, but it needs to be done well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about the idea of branding, when you talk about tourism in New Zealand, people think about Maori culture, and that plays a very significant part of tourism in New Zealand. And I think that itself is the way it has branded itself, the culture has branded itself to an international audience. And I guess there would be also other Maori businesses that have come up in agriculture as well.
Oh, totally. And, that branding element is so important, and it's so important for the global market as well, because they want to be purchasing product which is not only good product but is ethical, and is everyone wants to be a part of that 100% pure New Zealand sort of brand. And I could be wrong, but I don't know if there's that much certification that happens in New Zealand around being able to apply that brand. But there is huge power in that brand, and so I guess how can we do that within across or within other countries, within other communities, is creating that brand that works. But I think the most important thing is making sure that we, in order for that, like for instance, our brand in New Zealand is 100% pure New Zealand. Well, it's a falsehood in many instances, and in many ways, but it's a great brand, right? It gets people coming to New Zealand and they believe that New Zealand's this pure, clean, green environment, and that's what we sell ourselves on. It's not true. There are parts of it which are true, but I think there probably needs to be a sort of an independent certification process around how we do branding, and making sure there's truth to it. If we were 100% pure green, we wouldn't have to do anything around all of our climate change impact and all those sorts of things, and cleaning up of our waterways.
Just don't tell that to the tourists.
Yeah, exactly, right? So there's power in a brand, right? And there's power to brand at a national scale, but there's power to brand at a local and regional scale as well. It's just about how do we put the narrative around it, and then how do we make sure that we live and practice the values of that brand. And I think that could be a way that could bring groups together around a common cause, around a common initiative, and looking at the success story for New Zealand. It brings, it's 27. Tourism is 25% of our GDP. We can tag 25% of our GDP to 100% pure New Zealand.
Nice. Okay, we've got another question from Rudi Azra, also from Indonesia. It's a bit similar to the previous question, but I'll just read it out in case you had other additional thoughts on it. So they've been reading articles on, the fellows have been reading articles on indigenous communities and conservation. So he says, from the articles that we've read, Indigenous people living in close proximity with conservation areas play important roles in the long-term monitoring of the ecosystems and actively manage their own land. In one of the articles, it mentions scientists and governments need to be allies and involve Indigenous communities to achieve this. To what extent can government, scientists, and Indigenous people work together, and not just as rhetoric, but substantial action? Governments must also adjust their policies in order to achieve Indigenous communities' needs and rights. Is this achievable or not? I think it's similar to the previous question. I guess he's just expressing a bit more cynicism towards the relation, the multi-stakeholder relation.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, right? So these relationships are always difficult. Working with Indigenous groups and government and scientists, and I think the issue here is there's a significant power imbalance within that relationship, right? Indigenous groups are always seen as the minority, the other. Government has the money and the power of legislation and policy, and scientists are seen as the fonts of all knowledge, and never shall their knowledge be questioned. When the when you get to a point where that interface becomes difficult, right? So when the government says, well, we are the legislators, we have the power, we have the policy, and science just says we have the knowledge, and it's only our knowledge that we should use. There's already a really direct challenge there, because Indigenous groups have their own knowledge, have their own understandings of their world and their own relationships with their environment, and have intimate understandings of their environment according to their traditions, according to their narratives and to their stories. And science often, particularly Western science, undermines that in many ways and says that it is that science, Western science, is higher on the pecking order because we have evidence and it's written down, and I've got a PhD, and so that totally undermines the knowledge that is held within that community. Also, Indigenous groups, particularly here in New Zealand, for them, they are they exercise what we call tino rangatiratanga, or their own sovereignty over their land. They are they have their own. They see themselves as their own self-governing system of people that have control over their own lands. And so all of a sudden you've got the government that comes in and says, no, you don't. So we're in a situation where there's automatically competing. And so I think my view of it is that in those environments, in that context, the ability for the Crown, for the government, and for scientists to participate in that space to assist Indigenous groups in terms of the management and the care of the lands should always be done on the terms of that Indigenous group. It's on their terms. It's their land. You get invited into their land. And if they don't like what you're saying and what you're doing to them, then you get kicked out. But that's how I see it. I see that you cannot undermine that Indigenous group, just like you can't undermine any community. If you're going in there and you want to create change, then that change and that power dynamic and influence must be held by that Indigenous group. And they should have the autonomy to say yes or no. And it should be up to them and their leadership and their wisdom to ensure that how it goes is done according to their traditions and their beliefs and their ways of doing things. Otherwise, if we don't do that, then it's just another form of colonization, or it's just another form of stealing people's knowledge and doing things to people as opposed to with people. So in New Zealand, it's been that has been a very, very long battle and a significant change. But we are seeing a lot of our communities, Indigenous communities, actively doing that and telling the government, go away. We don't need you here. And if you are here, it's on these terms. We don't need you to come and fix us. We've seen that before. You come and then you go, and then you leave the mess for us to clean up afterwards. And you create policies, or you create changes which are totally unsustainable, which cannot be funded into the future. And you leave us ostracized and unempowered. So I always say that our Indigenous communities don't need empowering, because I think that's a wrong way of framing it, right? They've already got power. Sometimes I think they might need enabling, they might need support, they might need help, but that's got to be on their terms. It's not for us to go and say that you need to be empowered. It's for them to reach out and go, we need some assistance in a particular area. We're facing a challenge in this space. And it's up to us to heed that call and say, cool, what do we need to do? How can we help? There's too much sort of doing to and not enough doing with our communities, our Indigenous communities. And look, that's a hard thing to change, particularly as the point that I raised before, funding models. You know, government organizations and non-government organizations and scientists who are tied with universities get funded on particular KPIs, right? If you don't meet the KPIs, you don't get the funding. If you don't get the funding, then you can't pay your bills.
Right.
So yeah, it's and that interface is quite hard. So then we get to a question of how do we change the system? You know, if we want to create meaningful and impactful change, then the system needs to change to create that.
That'll take a while.
A long time.
Yeah.
But and that's where we're going to in terms of Māori culture is let's not attack the person, or let's not attack the government official or the scientist. Let's go for the system. Let's break the system and remold it.
Your point about there's too much working to or doing to rather than doing with. Because this next question by Mark from Malaysia, the way he's framed it, this question is quite interesting. He says, in Sarawak, we have a local tribe that used to be hunter-gatherers. That said, they don't really settle down and are not experienced with agriculture, trade, maintaining cleanliness, etc. Environmental conservation and governmental groups have targeted to help these tribes to become stewards of the forest, but over the years of pampering, they have become complacent and negligent. Now more than ever, they've become materialistic and only work with groups that benefit them through handouts. How can we help? How can we get groups like this back on tracks without needing to poke a bigger hole in the wallet?
Yeah.
Pretty heavy question.
That's a really heavy question. It's a real question, right? So, you know, for us, so our colonial story, our colonization story, is, you know, started in the 1800s when British ships and European ships came to our shores and stole our lands, raped and pillaged our lands and our women and our people, created wars and killed people, and left us, in many sense, landless and deprived. However, the greatest effect, I believe, that will have a lasting pain within our society, within our Indigenous community, isn't necessarily the loss of land, because we can get that back. Isn't necessarily the death and the killing, because we'll grieve that, we'll acknowledge that, and that is what it is, and we will ensure that it doesn't happen again. But I think the biggest pain that has been caused through this story of colonization is dependency, and it's like a drug. It's like an addiction, and our governments are really, really good at dependency and creating dependency, because if they have dependency, then they have power. So
it's all part of the system that you're trying to break right now.
And we're going to break that system. We've got to break dependency, and that's why I'm so keen on this movement around self-determination, the determination of our Indigenous groups to say no, to not be reliant on this capitalist system that sees us, utilizing money as our mechanism to fix the ills of the world, to be dependent on the dollar, to being to place the problem of our challenges on the government or others for them to fix it, because they won't fix it. If you want to lose weight, don't tell the other person to go for. You can't tell another person to go for a run for you or eat your food for you. You've got to do it yourself. So it's that challenge that we're facing, and if we truly want to achieve the vision, the legacy, the aspirations of our ancestors, the aspirations of our parents, and to fulfill the dreams that you have for your own children and for your own future, you've really got to do it yourself. You've got to build a team, you've got to build a tribe, you've got to build an army, and you've got to do it yourself. And that's why I'm so sort of strong in my view that self-determination is the way to solving this, and to remove the Crown from, or the government from that, and to do it on your terms. Breaking the cycle of dependency is hard, is so incredibly hard, because what it does is it is breaking that dependency cycle means that you have to now look at yourself and look at your own grouping, your own tribe, your own people, and now we collectively are now responsible for our own actions, and we collectively are responsible for making the change that we want to see. We no longer blame the government, because in order to be self-reliant and self-determining, we can't blame someone else. It's up to us now. So it requires significant unlearning, and because many of us have been conditioned with this model, on this cycle of dependency, it's going to take generations to get rid of it. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort. I've been caught staring in my fridge many a times looking for the answer to this big, hairy question, and it's really hard. But I think the solution to it is in my mind is looking to our past. What did we do in the past? What did we do? What did our grandparents do? What did we do 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago? And how do we relive that? Our past is our greatest prophet. So if we look to that wisdom of old, how do we relive that in the future? How do we give life to that mode of thinking? How do we give life to that self-determination? Because all dependency does is lock you in a state of inertia, where your wheels are spinning and you're creating all this smoke, but you're not going anywhere. You're not doing anything. So we've got to get rid of that. We've got to get rid of that inertia, and that dependency, and it's a hard journey to take, because it's about you taking leadership and saying, no, the government's not going to fix my problems for me. I'm going to do it. I'm going to be accountable. I'm going to do it. And that is a hard one to break. But I'd like to say that I think the younger generation are up for that challenge. I think the older generation feel, I'm sorry for anyone who's from the older generation, feel somewhat entitled, somewhat that's what they deserve and how it is, and that the government did all these wrong things, so that this is their payment for all the wrong things that they've done to us. But I think the younger generation have seen it and see that it doesn't work, and it doesn't give them agency, and doesn't drive their why, and doesn't give them purpose, and doesn't give them power. So I think there is a strong, well, at least I hope there is. I hope there's a strong renaissance of our younger generation who are keen to fight the fight differently, and rid ourselves of dependency.
I love that point about breaking the dependency cycle. We've got a couple of questions on technology. Kara from Indonesia says, there are rare cases of technological development with the well-being of Indigenous communities, since it would eventually shift their land use for the sake of the country's income. How could the government monetize Indigenous land without disrupting the community's life, and they would also benefit from the technology? Are there any cases where technology is built solely for Indigenous communities?
Not that I know of. I know that Indigenous people have created tools and technologies over millennia for the harvesting of their food and all that sort of stuff.
I can't really think of any. Well, okay, I did come across one in Cambodia and one in Malaysia relating to, actually the one in Malaysia, they're doing a digital identity for refugees. And in Cambodia, it's using, I can't remember, but basically some sort of digital technology that relates with Khmer, something related to the minority communities. I can't remember what it exactly are, but those are the only two I can think of, but not necessarily related to conservation. It was more about like having a national identity or digital identity for communities that were not recognized or not represented enough. But I can't really think of. Good question, Kyra.
Good question.
Got me stumped.
The tools. No, but I guess in terms of, we've utilized Western legislation to give effect to things like legal personhood and all that sort of stuff. So that's innovation in terms of legislation. But I don't know about tools. Yeah. No, I'll think about that one and I'll come back to you.
Okay. Yeah. Right. All right. We have Trisha from the Philippines. She asks, in this time of environmental crisis, should we prioritize introducing technological innovations to our Indigenous communities, or should we continue to trust and rely on the local knowledge that has helped them survive for years?
I think it's an and. My answer is probably yes to both. I think we've got to bring about new technologies to help adapt, and then I think we've got to apply the Indigenous knowledge that they have already, and trust that as well. So it's an and because climate change is going to affect those Indigenous groups and Indigenous peoples as well. And so they've got to be able to adapt as well. And so their knowledge is informed by their understanding of their relationship with the environment, which has been predicated on thousands of years of that connection. And climate change will see a rapid change in that environment. So to a point where they are adjusting to something that they've never seen before and is not in their cultural tradition or in their cultural memory. They're going to need the tools just as much as anyone else does to ensure that they survive, and because they are dependent on that food and dependent on that way of life, it's even more important that they have those ways of doing things. So I think it's an and scenario for that one.
I just suddenly remembered there is some tech out there that, for forest monitoring. I think it's I remember seeing one on the sidelines of a UN conference, and it's an open source software that they had, Open Forest or whatever it was called. But basically, I think if you have such technologies that allow better monitoring of forests, preventing deforestation, for example, that allows, or that would help, say, Indigenous communities be more aware and in terms of monitoring their landscapes. I mean, given the vastness of some of these landscapes, that might be one of those technologies that are useful for them.
Oh, totally. Modeling tools, environmental monitoring tools, all those sorts of things. But I guess so we've got to be able to do those sorts of things, but we've also got to make sure that they've got the infrastructure to run that.
Yeah.
And also
sustained funding, not just a 5-year project.
It's a 5-year project, right? Because what we do in that scenario is, we've got this cool tool, and we've created a whole bunch of data, and then how do we turn that data into information, and information into knowledge, and then how do we apply that knowledge in a real world environment? So it's about making sure that we've got the infrastructure and the funding to ensure that we can apply things across that whole continuum, from getting the data all the way through to creating the knowledge and applying it, and that we're just not funding one bit of that system, a bit of that continuum. You've got all this information. Oh yes, we know where all of our amazing trees are, and we know all the key trees, and we know all the key streams, and we know the state of our environment. Cool. Now what?
And then
we knew that already anyway. We already knew that we don't, too many trees are lost, and our streams aren't in the best shape, and our soil is degrading really, really badly, and it's going to be hard to grow crops. We already kind of knew that. So how do we apply that information, and then how do we create the knowledge, and then how do we create the interventions at the same time? So making sure that we're investing across that whole continuum is really, really important.
Yeah, great point. How do you apply the tech that benefits communities, basically?
Exactly, because we can spend $1 million on an amazing piece of kit, but
yeah,
an amazing piece of kit could be a blimmin' doorstop in a year's time.
Yeah. Okay, I guess, just to wrap up, I've got a couple of final questions that I asked all the guests on Breaking Silos. So what does breaking silos mean to you, and what advice would you give someone who wants to break silos in addressing environmental challenges?
Oh, just do it. Just crack on. And insert yourselves in conversations, bring people together, collaborate and work with other people, share the conversation. Don't be scared, be bold. Our environment requires us to be bold, and to be bold we need to break those silos. We need to be vertically and horizontally integrated in our approach and how we deliver things, We need to create a common cause. We need to identify issues, or create or make issues aware to people. Identify opportunities where we can create Trojan horse moments, and then all of a sudden, bang! We're in there. Don't underestimate the value and the importance of your voice. Influence wherever you can, and speak to the things that you believe in wherever and however you can, because your voice will spread 1,000 times. The words that you say, the stories that you share, have so much power and influence. That's how we got where we got to in New Zealand with our changes in our legislation around how we frame our environment. We just said it so many times. We shared the story so many times that it just got imprinted into people's minds and into the minds of people who make the final decision. So it's, just keep on breaking the silos by doing the doing and then talking about the doing, and creating those opportunities for ideas to fly high and then to be grounded and then implemented. Just be disruptive. Don't be scared. Be bold. Our earth deserves.
I love that. Well, thanks, Kara, for your time today. Was there any final thoughts or final shout-out message you wanted to say before we end?
Just awesome. Thank you, guys. Good luck on your work. I'm excited to see what you guys do and get up to. I guess just also a big shout out to the East West Centre and all that they're doing as well. And hopefully this whole COVID thing clears up and I can make my way over to Hawaii and enjoy some of the sunshine over there and pop into the East West Centre and say hello to the amazing people there who are doing amazing things. But I guess my only sort of one further note to everyone is just the world is small. Keep connected. Keep sharing your stories, and keep on talking with like-minded people. And Margaret Mead's quote, right? Hold on to that quote. Let that be your guide into the future. Because we are just a small, committed group of people, and we can change the world. So good luck with that. Be bold.
Lovely. I love that. Thank you, Kara. And thank you everyone for watching. Hope you got a lot out of this episode. If you haven't watched the previous 7 episodes, check out the playlist, and do comment and let us know what you think about it. And so from me, Sophia Jamil in Singapore, and Kara Dentice in Wellington, thanks for watching. See ya.
Thanks.